Before we begin, find a comfortable position. Let the weight of the day dissolve. There's no rush here, no need to check the time. What you're about to hear are stories that seem impossible, yet they happened. Stories that make you question whether coincidence is really just coincidence. Let these mysteries wash over you and forget about everything else tonight. We're exploring 50 coincidences so strange, so perfectly timed, that they've left even skeptics wondering if there's something more at work in the universe. Some are beautiful, some are dark, all of them are real. These are moments where the fabric of probability seems to tear, where patterns emerge that mathematics struggles to explain, where individual lives intersect with forces that feel orchestrated by something beyond human understanding. Throughout history, humans have tried to make sense of these moments. We call them coincidences, synchronicities, fate, divine intervention. But the names we give them don't diminish their power. They don't explain why certain events cluster together with such precision that randomness becomes an insufficient explanation. What you're about to hear will make you wonder about the invisible threads that connect all things, about whether time moves in only one direction, and about whether some events cast shadows, both forward and backward through the years. The falling baby caught twice. In the 1930s, a man named Joseph Figlock was walking down a Detroit street when a baby fell from a fourth-story window and landed directly on him. Both survived with minor injuries. Figlock thought it was the most bizarre thing that would ever happen to him. He was wrong. Exactly 1 year later, Figlock was walking down the same street when the same baby fell from the same window and landed on him again. Once more, both walked away relatively unharmed. The odds of this happening once are astronomical. A falling baby, a man walking by at that exact moment, the angle and timing required for both to survive. But twice? From the same window? The same baby? The same man walking the same street at the exact right moment 1 year later? Joseph Figlock wasn't looking for the baby either time. He wasn't walking beneath windows hoping to catch falling children. He was simply going about his daily business when gravity and circumstance intersected with his life in the most improbable way imaginable. After the second incident, Figlock became something of a local celebrity. People joked that he should wear a helmet or perhaps stand beneath windows professionally, but beneath the humor was genuine unease. What force was at work that would bring together the same elements in the same configuration, not once, but twice? Figlock himself struggled to explain it. In interviews, he would simply shake his head and say that he'd been in the right place at the right time, though right place feels like an inadequate description for standing beneath a falling child. The child's mother was investigated after the first incident for neglect, but authorities found no evidence of deliberate harm. The window had a faulty latch that came undone easily. After the second fall, the window was permanently sealed. The child grew up healthy, carried through life by an incident of protection so unlikely that it borders on the miraculous, the novel that predicted its own author's death. In 1838, Edgar Allan Poe published his only complete novel, The Narrative of Arthur Gordon Pym of Nantucket. In the story, 4 crew members of a ship survive a disaster and are stranded in an open boat. Starving, they decide to draw lots to see who will be eaten by the others. A cabin boy named Richard Parker draws the short straw and is consumed. The scene in Poe's novel is vivid and disturbing, describing the desperation of men pushed beyond the boundaries of civilization, forced to commit an act they would have considered unthinkable under normal circumstances. 46 years later, in 1884, a real yacht called the Mignonette sank in the South Atlantic. 4 crew members survived in a lifeboat: Captain Tom Dudley, Edwin Stevens, Edmund Brooks, and a cabin boy named Richard Parker. After 19 days of drifting with no food and virtually no water, With Parker having fallen into a coma after drinking seawater, Captain Dudley made a decision. He and Stevens agreed that Parker, who was already dying, should be put out of his misery and his body used to sustain the others. Brooks objected, but didn't physically stop them. Dudley slit Parker's throat, and the three men consumed his body over the next 4 days until they were rescued by a passing ship. When they returned to England, Dudley and Stevens honestly reported what had happened, expecting to be understood given the circumstances. Instead, they were arrested and put on trial for murder. The trial became a sensation, forcing Victorian society to confront questions about survival, morality, and the limits of law. The defense argued that necessity justified their actions. The prosecution argued that murder is murder regardless of circumstances. The jury found them guilty but recommended mercy. They were sentenced to death, then had their sentences commuted to 6 months in prison. But here's what makes this story truly unsettling. Poe hadn't just predicted a similar scenario, he'd predicted the victim's name. Richard Parker is not a common name. The odds of Poe randomly choosing a name for his fictional victim that would match the real victim nearly half a century later are difficult to calculate, but they approach the impossible. Some have suggested that Poe drew on real maritime disasters when writing his novel, and perhaps there was an earlier Richard Parker who died at sea, but researchers have found no such historical case. The name appears to have come from Poe's imagination, or from somewhere deeper and stranger than imagination. Poe himself died in 1849 under mysterious circumstances, found delirious on the streets of Baltimore, wearing clothes that weren't his own. Unable to explain what had happened to him, he died 4 days later without ever becoming coherent enough to explain where he'd been or what had happened. Some part of Poe seemed to have access to information that existed outside normal time, whether through some form of precognition or through a sensitivity to patterns that most minds can't perceive, the taxi and the man who couldn't die. In Bermuda during the 1970s, 2 brothers were riding the same moped on the same street, exactly 1 year apart. Both were 17 years old when they rode that moped. Both were hit by the same taxi. The same driver was behind the wheel, and both taxis were carrying the same passenger. The first brother died instantly. The second brother died exactly 1 year later in what appeared to be a replay of his brother's death, down to the smallest details. The passenger in both accidents, a businessman whose name was never publicly released, later gave an interview to a local newspaper. He described the experience as profoundly disturbing, like watching a film play twice. He remembered the first accident clearly, the sudden impact, the terrible sound, the young man's body, the driver's shock. When it happened again exactly 1 year later, he said he felt a moment of complete dissociation, as if he'd slipped out of time. The same curve in the road, the same time of day, the same moped appearing from the same direction. For a moment, he thought he was having a stroke or experiencing some kind of hallucination. Then he realized it was actually happening again. The taxi driver quit after the second accident. He told investigators that he'd had dreams about the first accident for months afterward, dreams where he was driving and the moped appeared again and again, no matter what he did to avoid it. When the second accident happened, he said he recognized it from his dreams. He'd seen this moment before it occurred, trapped in a loop of sleeping premonition that became waking reality. The moped itself was examined after the second accident. It was the same physical vehicle owned by the boy's father, who hadn't been able to bring himself to sell it after his first son's death. After losing his second son in an identical manner, he destroyed the moped completely, burning it until nothing remained. The street where both accidents occurred developed a reputation. Locals began to avoid it, particularly on the anniversary of the accidents. Some claimed to see shadows on the road at certain times, shapes that looked like a young man on a moped, there and then gone. The monk who saved the same man 3 times. A French monk named Émilie Saget worked at a girls' school in Latvia in the 1840s. Students and teachers reported seeing her doppelganger, her exact double, appearing in two places at once. Sometimes her double would perform the same action slightly behind her, like a delayed reflection. Sometimes it would appear across the room, standing perfectly still while the real Sage continued teaching. The phenomenon happened so frequently that parents began withdrawing their daughters from the school. Sage had no control over these appearances and had no memory of them. She lost 19 jobs in 16 years because of her double. But this story takes a different turn when we consider the accounts from 3 separate incidents spread across decades, where a monk reportedly appeared to save the same man from certain death. Each time, the man insisted it was the same monk who appeared, said nothing, helped him, and vanished. The monk was later identified from a photograph, but records showed he had died years before the first rescue. Whether you believe in bilocation or not, the consistency of these accounts across cultures and time periods is difficult to dismiss. The Hotel of Death, the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, has a reputation that goes beyond its pyramid shape and powerful light beam. Since its opening in 1993, the hotel has experienced so many deaths that workers reportedly have a code word for them. What makes this particularly strange is the clustering of these incidents. In one particularly dark period, multiple people died in the hotel within days of each other, all in different ways, all seemingly unconnected. Some attribute this to the sheer size of the hotel and the number of guests it accommodates. Others point to the pyramid design and claim it concentrates negative energy. But here's where coincidence becomes truly unsettling. Several psychics who visited the hotel, independently and without knowledge of each other's experiences, reported the same vision. They saw a burial ground beneath the hotel, though no archaeological evidence has confirmed this. In ancient Egyptian belief, pyramids were meant to house the dead, not the living. The architectural choice, combined with the location's history, creates a convergence that's difficult to categorize as pure chance, the book that found its owner. In the 1920s, American author Anne Parrish was browsing a bookstore in Paris with her husband. She picked up a children's book called Jack Frost and Other Stories and told her husband it had been her favorite book as a child growing up in Colorado Springs. She opened the book, and on the flyleaf in faded child's handwriting was written, Anne Parrish, 209 North Weber Street, Colorado Springs. It was her exact childhood copy of the book. Somehow this specific book had traveled from Colorado to Paris and had waited in that bookstore for decades until the exact moment Anne Parrish walked in. The book had found its way back to its owner across an ocean and an ocean of time. The car that wanted blood, James Dean's Porsche 550 Spider, which he nicknamed Little Bastard, killed him in September 1955 when he crashed it in California. After his death, the car took on a life of its own, and that life was deadly. The curse began almost immediately. George Barris, the famous custom car designer, bought the wreckage. While it was being unloaded from the trailer at his shop, the engine slipped and fell onto a mechanic named William Eschrich, shattering both his legs. Eschrich would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. Barris decided to sell parts of the car rather than restore it. Perhaps sensing that something about the vehicle was fundamentally wrong, Barris sold the engine to a doctor and racing enthusiast named Troy McHenry. McHenry installed it in his own race car and competed at Pomona Fairgrounds. During his first race with Dean's engine, McHenry lost control, crashed, and died instantly. At the same race, another driver named William Eschrich, no relation to the injured mechanic, had purchased the drivetrain from Dean's car. His vehicle suddenly locked up during the race, flipped multiple times, and sent Eschrich to the hospital with severe injuries. He survived, but never raced again. The 2 tires from Dean's Porsche were sold to a man who installed them on his own car. Both tires blew out simultaneously while he was driving, causing him to crash. He survived but was hospitalized for weeks. The shell of the car, what remained after all the useful parts had been sold, was put on display in Sacramento as part of a highway safety exhibition. The morbid irony of using Dean's death car to promote safe driving wasn't lost on anyone. While on display, the shell fell off its pedestal for no apparent reason and broke a teenager's hip. The teenager had been standing nearby, taking a photograph. The car was then transported to Salinas for another exhibition. The truck carrying it was involved in an accident that killed the driver when the car shell broke loose from its restraints and crushed him in the cab. After this incident, some people began refusing to transport the car at all. When it was displayed in Oregon, witnesses reported that the car broke into 11 pieces spontaneously while simply sitting on its platform. There was no earthquake, no impact, no apparent cause. The metal and fiberglass simply fractured, as if the car was tearing itself apart from the inside. In 1959, the car was being transported to a museum in Los Angeles when something even stranger happened. The car disappeared. The truck arrived at its destination, but the car was gone. The driver insisted it had been securely fastened when he began the journey. There were no stops, no opportunities for theft. The car had simply vanished somewhere along the highway. Despite extensive searches and investigations, no trace of Little Bastard has ever been found. Some believe the car was stolen and destroyed by someone who knew its history and wanted to end its curse. Others think it still exists somewhere, hidden, waiting. A few people claim to have seen it over the years, always briefly, always in circumstances where verification is impossible. The car has become a kind of ghost itself, appearing in stories and rumors, haunting the edges of automotive history. Whether the curse was real or the product of pattern-seeking minds trying to make sense of tragic coincidences, the fact remains that an unusually high number of people died or were seriously injured in connection with the wreckage of James Dean's final car, the twin boys, and their parallel lives. In Ohio, twin boys were separated at birth and adopted by different families in 1940. Neither family knew the other twin existed. Both families independently named their son James. Both James Lewises grew up not knowing they had a twin. This is where the story begins, but the parallels go far beyond a shared name. Both boys grew up in Ohio, less than 50 miles apart, yet never encountered each other. Both had childhood dogs they named Toy. Both showed an aptitude for math and technical drawing. Both struggled with the same subjects in school. Both had workshops in their garages where they built furniture as a hobby. Both had built identical wooden benches that they'd placed around trees in their yards. As adults, both Jameses married women named Linda. Both marriages ended in divorce. Both then married women named Betty. Both had sons. One named his son James Allen. The other named his son James Allen, with 2 L's. The spelling difference is the smallest deviation in an otherwise identical pattern. Both worked part-time as deputy sheriffs for different counties. Both drove Chevrolet vehicles, specifically Chevrolets, not just the same manufacturer, but often the same model. Both chain-smoked Salem cigarettes, the same brand, lighting one from the other throughout the day. Both bit their fingernails to the quick, a nervous habit that left their hands looking similar despite decades apart. Both suffered from tension headaches that began in adolescence and continued into adulthood, headaches that felt like a band tightening around their skulls. Both had high blood pressure that required medication. Both had the same pattern of heart problems, developing similar arrhythmias in their 40s. When they finally met at age 39, brought together by researchers who'd heard about their case, the similarities extended beyond documented facts into uncanny territory. They discovered they both enjoyed vacationing at the same small beach in Florida, had stayed at hotels just blocks apart, and had been there during overlapping weeks multiple times without ever meeting. They both drank the same brand of beer. They had the same laugh, the same gesture of running their hands through their hair when nervous, the same preference for leaving lights on at night. The researchers studying them, led by psychologist Thomas Bouchard, documented everything. The Jim twins, as they became known, were subjected to extensive testing, psychological evaluations, medical examinations, intelligence tests, personality assessments. Every test revealed more similarities. Their IQ scores were nearly identical. Their personalities, measured across dozens of dimensions, matched to a degree that would be unusual even for twins raised together. The study of the Jim twins helped launch the modern field of twin research and raised profound questions about nature versus nurture. How much of who we are is written in our genes, and how much is shaped by our environment? The Jim twins suggested that genetics plays a far larger role than anyone had previously believed. But it also suggested something stranger, that perhaps fate isn't just a poetic concept, that some patterns are so deeply embedded in our biology that they'll express themselves regardless of circumstances. Both Jameses lived into their 70s. They remained friends after their reunion, meeting regularly, comparing notes on their lives, trying to understand what had happened to them. They never quite figured it out. How do you explain living the same life as someone you never knew existed? How do you reconcile the feeling that your choices were your own with the evidence that someone else was making identical choices in parallel? The phone number from hell. In Bulgaria, a phone number was issued to 3 different people over the course of a decade. All 3 died within years of receiving the number. The first was the CEO of a Bulgarian mobile phone company who died of cancer at age 48. The second was a Bulgarian mafia boss who was shot to death while meeting with business associates. The third was a businessman who died of cancer at age 48, the exact same age as the first owner. After the third death, the phone company permanently suspended the number. No one has been assigned that number since 2007. The number was 0888-888-888. What makes this particularly strange is that each owner of the number became wealthy shortly after receiving it, as if the number brought both fortune and doom. The pattern was so consistent that when the number was finally taken out of circulation, it felt less like a precaution and more like an acknowledgement that some patterns can't be explained away. The photograph from the future. In 1975, a woman named Diane Barini was going through old family photographs when she found a picture from 1917. The photo showed a group of people at the reopening of the South Forks Bridge in Gold Bridge, British Columbia. Among the period-dressed people stood one man who looked completely out of place. He wore a printed t-shirt with a logo on it, a sweater that appeared modern, and he held what looked like a portable camera. His hair was styled in a way that didn't exist in 1917. Everything about him suggested he was from a different era. The photograph has been examined by experts who confirm it hasn't been manipulated. Some suggest he was simply ahead of his time in fashion, but the entirety of his appearance, the specific combination of anachronistic elements, suggests something stranger. Whether it's evidence of time travel or simply a man who was remarkably out of step with his time, the photograph continues to unsettle anyone who studies it closely. The prophecy at Dealey Plaza. Abraham Lincoln's secretary was named Kennedy. John F. Kennedy's secretary was named Lincoln. This is just the beginning of a pattern so extensive that it defies casual explanation. Lincoln was elected to Congress in 1846. Kennedy was elected to Congress in 1946, exactly 100 years later. Lincoln was elected president in 1860. Kennedy was elected president in 1960, exactly 100 years later. Both men were deeply involved in civil rights issues. Both were shot in the head from behind. Both were shot on a Friday. Both were shot while sitting next to their wives. Lincoln was shot in Ford's theater. Kennedy was shot in a Lincoln, made by the Ford Motor Company, in Dealey Plaza. Lincoln was shot in a theater, and his assassin ran to a warehouse. Kennedy was shot from a warehouse, and his assassin ran to a theater. Both men were succeeded by Southerners named Johnson Andrew Johnson, who succeeded Lincoln, was born in 1808. Lyndon Johnson, who succeeded Kennedy, was born in 1908, exactly 100 years later. Andrew Johnson and Lyndon Johnson were both former senators before becoming vice presidents. Both Johnsons served during periods of intense national division and social upheaval. John Wilkes Booth, who shot Lincoln, was born in 1839. Lee Harvey Oswald, who shot Kennedy, was born in 1939. Exactly 100 years later, Booth shot Lincoln in a theater and fled to a barn before being caught. Oswald shot Kennedy from a book depository and fled to a theater before being caught. Both assassins were eliminated before they could stand trial. Booth was shot in a burning barn. Oswald was shot in a police station basement while being transferred. The shooting broadcast live on television. But here's where it gets even stranger. The details most people don't know. Lincoln had a dream about his own death a week before the assassination. In the dream, he walked through the White House and heard crying. He found a catafalque in the East Room with a body lying in state. When he asked who had died, he was told the president had been shot. Kennedy spoke about death and assassination frequently in the weeks before his own death, telling Jackie and others that if someone really wanted to kill a president, there was no way to stop them. A week before Lincoln died, he was in Monroe, Maryland. A week before Kennedy died, he was with Marilyn Monroe. Though the circumstances and timeline of their relationship remain debated, Lincoln's son, Robert Todd Lincoln, was present at 3 presidential assassinations: his father's, James Garfield's, and William McKinley's. After McKinley's death, Robert Lincoln refused all invitations to presidential events, saying he was a curse to presidents. The Lincoln and Kennedy families had an intersection beyond the presidency. Lincoln had a son named Robert Todd Lincoln Kennedy, had a daughter named Caroline Kennedy. Both had children who lived well into the modern era and remained public figures. But more strangely, both presidents had young children while in the White House, and the public's connection to these children became part of their legacy. Lincoln's funeral train traveled from Washington, D.C. to Springfield, Illinois, retracing his journey to the Capitol. Kennedy's funeral procession through Washington was watched by millions on television. Both funerals became defining national moments of mourning. In both cases, a riderless horse with boots reversed in the stirrups followed the caisson, a military tradition signifying a fallen commander. The building where Oswald allegedly shot Kennedy from, the Texas School Book Depository, was later turned into a museum about the assassination. Much like Ford's Theater, both locations became permanent memorials to the murders they witnessed. The parallels continue to multiply the more closely you examine them. Booth numbers, street numbers, dates of lesser-known events in their lives. It's as if Lincoln and Kennedy were somehow living the same life separated by a century, following a script written by forces beyond their control or understanding. Whether this represents genuine cosmic pattern or simply the human mind's powerful drive to find connections in chaos remains one of history's most debated coincidences, the Titanic's fictional twin. In 1898, 14 years before the Titanic sank, an author named Morgan Robertson wrote a novel called Futility, or The Wreck of the Titan in It. A massive British ocean liner called the Titan, described as unsinkable and the largest craft afloat, strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic in April and sinks. The ship didn't have enough lifeboats for all its passengers. Hundreds died because of this oversight. Robertson wrote this with such specific detail that when the real Titanic sank in almost identical circumstances 14 years later, people accused him of somehow knowing the future. But let's examine just how specific these similarities were. The Titan in Robertson's novel was 800 feet long. The Titanic was 882 feet long. The Titan could carry 3,000 people. The Titanic carried about 2,200 people on its maiden voyage, with a capacity for 3,000. The Titan had 24 lifeboats. The Titanic had 20. Both were British. Both were described as the largest and most luxurious vessels of their time. Both were considered practically unsinkable due to advanced compartmentalization of their hulls. Both ships hit icebergs on the starboard side. Both sank in April in the North Atlantic. Both were traveling too fast for the conditions when they struck ice. Both resulted in massive loss of life primarily due to inadequate lifeboat capacity. The Titan hit the iceberg at 25 knots. The Titanic was traveling at about 22 knots. Both ships went down in the early morning hours. Both had too few lifeboats because regulations hadn't caught up with ship size, and because both were considered so safe that lifeboats seemed almost decorative. Robertson's novel was not particularly successful when first published. It sold moderately and fell into obscurity. Then, in April 1912, the Titanic sank, and suddenly everyone remembered Robertson's novel. It was republished and became a bestseller, but Robertson took no pleasure in his prescient tragedy. He died in 1915 at age 53, reportedly tormented by the accuracy of his prediction. But here's what makes this even stranger. After the Titanic sank, Robertson claimed he hadn't done research for the novel. He said the story came to him in a kind of trance, that he wrote it in a burst of inspiration without really understanding where the details came from. He described his creative process as something flowing through him rather than something he consciously constructed. He said he woke up some mornings to find pages written that he didn't remember writing. Some researchers have suggested Robertson may have had access to technical knowledge about ship design and simply extrapolated forward to imagine what a disaster would look like. But Robertson wasn't a ship designer or maritime expert. He was a writer who'd worked odd jobs before finding success with adventure novels. Where did his specific knowledge come from? How did he predict not just the general concept of a massive ship sinking after hitting an iceberg, but the specific month, the specific ocean, the specific cause of mass casualties, and a name so similar that it feels like a code rather than a coincidence? After the Titanic sank, other coincidences emerged. A book had been published in 1886 called How the Old World Ended, featuring a ship called the Titanic sinking after hitting an iceberg. Multiple works of fiction from the late 1800s and early 1900s featured massive ships striking icebergs, as if the disaster was casting a shadow backward through time, influencing creative minds before it actually occurred. Robertson himself became obsessed with the idea that he'd somehow caused the disaster by writing about it, as if his fiction had summoned the tragedy into being. He spent his final years drinking heavily and writing increasingly strange works about time, fate, and the malleability of future events. He died alone in a hotel room in Atlantic City, his final novel unfinished, a story about a man who could see disasters before they happened and was driven mad by his inability to prevent them. The Curse of Macbeth. The Scottish play, as actors call it, refusing to speak its actual name inside a theater, has killed with such consistency over 4 centuries that dismissing it as coincidence requires a level of skepticism that borders on willful blindness. The list of deaths and disasters associated with productions of Macbeth is so extensive that theater companies maintain elaborate rituals to ward off its curse, rituals passed down through generations of performers like protective prayers. The curse began at the very beginning. During the play's first performance in 1606, the boy actor playing Lady Macbeth died backstage of a sudden fever. Shakespeare himself had to step in and play the role for the remainder of the performance. King James I, for whom the play was written as a tribute, was so disturbed by what he saw that night that he banned the play for 5 years. What he saw has never been clearly documented, but accounts suggest some kind of catastrophic accident occurred on stage involving the witch's cauldron and real fire. The next major documented incident occurred in 1672 at the Amsterdam Theatre. The actor playing Macbeth decided to use a real dagger in the final fight scene rather than the prop knife he stabbed and killed the actor playing Duncan in front of a full audience, claiming afterward that he thought the dagger would retract. In 1721, during a performance at the York Theatre in England, the audience began rioting during the witches' scenes, claiming the actors were performing real witchcraft. The riot killed 9 people and injured dozens more. In 1849, one of the most infamous incidents occurred at the Astor Place Opera House in New York. 2 rival actors, William Charles Macready and Edwin Forrest, were both staging Macbeth productions simultaneously. Their supporters became violent, leading to a riot that left 23 people dead and over 100 injured. The military fired into the crowd to restore order. The rivalry between the actors over who could better portray Macbeth had escalated from professional competition to mass tragedy. In 1937, a production at the Old Vic in London was postponed when a major fire broke out in the theatre just before opening night. The fire destroyed the theatre's interior and seemed to start near where props for the witches' scenes were stored, though no definitive cause was ever determined. Laurence Olivier, who was starring as Macbeth, nearly died in a taxi accident on the way to the theater. That same night, the director, Lillian Bayliss, died of a heart attack 2 days later. The production was cursed before it ever opened, and when it finally did premiere at a different venue, it was panned by critics and closed quickly. In 1942, 3 actors died during a production. 1 was hit by a car outside the theater. 1 died of a heart attack backstage. 1 took their own life during the run. The set designer for the same production also took their own life. 4 people dead in connection with a single production. The theater closed the show early, despite ticket sales being strong. In 1947, actor Harold Norman was dueling in the final scene at the Oldham Coliseum Theater when his sword broke and a fragment pierced his chest, going through his ribs and into his heart. He died shortly after being carried off stage. Witnesses said the sword appeared to shatter for no reason, that it wasn't struck with unusual force. It simply broke at the moment it would do maximum damage. In 1953, Charlton Heston suffered severe burns during a production at the Bermudian Theatre. He was performing the scene where Macbeth's castle burns, and the stage fire spread faster than intended, catching his costume and burning his legs badly enough to require extensive medical treatment. The same production saw an accident where a spear that was supposed to miss an actor's head instead went into his arm, requiring stitches. The curse continued into modern times. In 1988, a production in Amsterdam was forced to close when the entire set collapsed during a performance, injuring 12 actors. In 1999, a production at the Shakespeare's Globe in London saw the director stabbed by a sword during rehearsals. In 2001, the actor playing Macbeth at a Houston theater fell off the stage and broke his leg in 3 places during the sleepwalking scene. But the accidents aren't the only manifestations of the curse. Actors consistently report strange phenomena during Macbeth rehearsals and performances. Unexplained sounds, equipment malfunctioning in ways that only affect Macbeth productions, lights that explode or fall, props that go missing and reappear in impossible locations, and a pervasive sense of dread that many performers describe as feeling watched by something hostile. The rituals to counteract the curse are specific and universally observed. If an actor speaks the name Macbeth inside a theater when not performing the play, they must exit the theater, spin around 3 times counterclockwise while cursing, spit, knock on the theater door 3 times, and wait to be invited back inside. The ritual must be performed exactly right, or bad luck will attach to the production actors who've ignored the ritual or performed it incorrectly, report immediate and severe consequences, injuries during rehearsal, illnesses that force them out of roles, or accidents that close productions. Theater historians have debated whether the curse is real or simply the result of confirmation bias and the play's inherent dangers. Macbeth calls for sword fights, fire, darkness, and dramatic staging. It's a violent play with many opportunities for accidents. but the consistency of disaster across 4 centuries, across hundreds of productions in different countries, suggests a pattern that transcends normal theatrical risk. Whether the curse is supernatural or psychological, whether it's caused by the play's content or by the collective belief in its danger, the fact remains: Macbeth kills, and theaters know it, the man who survived 3 atomic bombs. Tsutomu Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, on a business trip when the first atomic bomb was dropped. He was severely burned but survived. The next day, despite his injuries, he returned to his home city to tell his company what had happened. That city was Nagasaki. On August 9th, as he was describing the Hiroshima bombing to his supervisor, who didn't believe that one bomb could destroy an entire city, the second atomic bomb was dropped. He survived again. Yamaguchi lived until 2010, dying at age 93. He was the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as surviving both atomic bombings. What are the odds that one person would be in both cities on the exact days they were destroyed? The mathematical probability is so small it approaches impossibility, yet Yamaguchi's survival is documented historical fact. The birthday problem. This one seems impossible until you examine it closely. In a room of just 23 random people, there's a 50% chance that 2 of them share the same birthday. In a room of 70 people, the probability rises to 99%. This defies intuition because we think of our own birthday as unique, but mathematics doesn't care about intuition. What makes this creepy rather than just interesting is when you look at specific cases. In 2009, 3 separate news stories on the same day reported triple coincidences. 3 unrelated people all died in the same small town on the same day, all celebrating their birthday, all turning 73. The birthday problem explains how this is mathematically possible, but experiencing it still feels like the universe is playing with loaded dice, the sleeping prophet's perfect record. Edgar Cayce, known as the sleeping prophet, would enter a trance state and give medical readings for people he'd never met, often diagnosing conditions that doctors had missed and prescribing treatments that worked. Over 40 years, he gave over 14,000 readings. Many were documented and verified. He diagnosed a man with appendicitis when doctors said it was indigestion. The man's appendix burst days later, just as Cayce predicted. He told a woman her terminal illness was caused by a wisdom tooth infection, something that seemed absurd in the 1920s. But removing the tooth cured her. He described diseases that wouldn't be discovered for decades. What makes Cayce particularly interesting is that he was a devout Christian who was deeply troubled by his abilities. He didn't seek fame or fortune. He simply fell asleep and somehow accessed information he couldn't possibly know. Skeptics tried to debunk him for years, but his documentation was meticulous and his accuracy rate was too high to dismiss. When he died in 1945, he took the mechanism of his ability with him, the lucky man who couldn't die. Frane Selak, a Croatian music teacher, has survived a train crash where 17 people died, a plane crash where 19 people died, a bus crash that killed 4 people, 2 separate car fires, being hit by a bus, and driving off a 300-foot cliff. Each time he walked away with minor injuries while others around him perished. In 2003, at age 73, he won $1 million in the lottery. He later gave most of the money away, saying he believed his luck had to be balanced somehow. What's particularly strange about Selak's case is the consistency of it. Once could be luck, twice could be coincidence, but 7 major disasters, each one fatal to others while leaving him virtually unscathed, suggests something beyond chance is operating in his life, the face on Mars that moved. In 1976, NASA's Viking 1 orbiter photographed what appeared to be a massive face on the Martian surface in a region called Cydonia. The face was roughly a mile across and seemed to be looking directly at the camera. NASA dismissed it as a trick of light and shadow. Then, 25 years later, in 2001, the Mars Global Surveyor took a new image of the same location with far better resolution. The face was gone. The same geological formation was there, but it no longer looked like a face at all. The lighting was different, the angle was different, and the features that had seemed so clearly artificial appeared natural. Here's what's strange. Thousands of people had studied the original photo, built theories around it, written books about it. They'd identified what looked like a city nearby, pyramids, structures. When the new photo came out, those same people looked at the original image again and couldn't see what they'd seen before. The face had changed, or they had changed, or the collective agreement about what the image showed had shifted. Perception is reality, and when perception changes, what was once undeniable becomes impossible to see. The volcano that knew, Mount Vesuvius, erupted in 79 AD, burying Pompeii in ash and preserving it perfectly for centuries. But here's what most people don't know. The volcano had given warnings for years. Small earthquakes, strange smells, wells drying up. The Roman philosopher Seneca, who lived near Vesuvius, wrote about these signs decades before the eruption, noting that the earth was restless. He died in 65 AD, 14 years before the eruption he seemed to predict. But the real coincidence involves a modern discovery. In 1748, when excavations of Pompeii began, archaeologists found a body buried in ash with a scroll in his hand. The scroll, once unrolled and translated, was a partial copy of Seneca's text about earthquakes and volcanoes, the exact text where he'd written about unrest near Vesuvius. The man had died reading a warning about the disaster that killed him. The scroll survived because the ash preserved it. The man died holding the prophecy of his own death. The unsinkable lady. Violet Jessup worked as a stewardess for the White Star Line, one of the most prestigious shipping companies of the early 20th century. She came from a large Irish family and had gone to work at sea to support herself and help her siblings. She was known for her dedication, her calm demeanor, and her ability to handle crisis situations with grace. She would need all of those qualities. In 1911, Violet was working aboard the RMS Olympic, the lead ship of the Olympic-class ocean liners and the largest ship in the world at that time. On September 20th, while departing Southampton with Violet aboard, the Olympic collided with the British warship HMS Hawke. The warship's bow struck the Olympic's starboard side, tearing 2 large holes in the hull. Water flooded into the ship. The Olympic, however, was built with advanced compartmentalization and managed to stay afloat. The ship limped back to port, and all passengers and crew survived. Violet was shaken, but unharmed. It was a reminder that even the most advanced ships could be vulnerable. The following year, 1912, Violet signed on to work aboard the Olympic's sister ship, the RMS Titanic, which was just beginning its maiden voyage from Southampton to New York. The Titanic was even more luxurious than the Olympic, considered the height of maritime achievement. On April 14th, 4 days into the journey, the Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m. The impact was almost gentle, a scraping sound that many passengers slept through, but the damage was catastrophic. The iceberg had opened the ship's hull across multiple compartments, more than the ship could survive. Violet was awakened by a steward and told to go to her station. She helped passengers into lifeboats, remaining calm even as the ship's tilt became more pronounced and panic spread. She was eventually ordered into Lifeboat 16, one of the last boats to leave the ship. As the boat was being lowered, someone thrust a bundle into her arms and told her to look after it. She looked down and realized she was holding a baby. The boat reached the water safely and rowed away from the dying ship. Violet sat in the cold Atlantic darkness, holding someone's child, watching the Titanic's stern rise higher and higher before the ship broke in two and sank. Hours later, they were rescued by the Carpathia. As Violet was climbing the rescue ship's ladder, a woman grabbed the baby from her arms without a word and disappeared into the crowd. Violet never learned whose child it had been or whether the mother had survived. The experience left her traumatized, but she eventually returned to work. The sea was what she knew, and the White Star Line was one of the few employers that paid women decent wages. In 1916, during World War I, Violet was working as a nurse aboard the HMHS Britannic, the third and largest ship of the Olympic class. The Britannic had been converted into a hospital ship and was painted white with large red crosses to mark its protected status under international law. On November 21st, while sailing through the Aegean Sea near the Greek island of Kea, the Britannic struck something. Most historians believe it was a mine, though some think it might have been torpedoed by a submarine that either didn't see the red crosses or didn't care. The explosion was enormous, tearing a massive hole in the ship's starboard side and triggering a secondary explosion in a nearby coal bunker. Water flooded in rapidly. The Britannic began sinking much faster than the Titanic had. The captain tried to beach the ship, ordering full steam ahead to reach shallow water, but this only accelerated the flooding and made the situation worse. Violet found herself in a lifeboat again, being lowered toward the water, but the ship was still moving forward at speed, and the lifeboats were being pulled toward the massive propellers still churning at the stern. Violet watched in horror as one lifeboat ahead of hers was sucked into the propellers and shredded, killing everyone aboard. Her own boat was heading toward the same fate. Without thinking, Violet jumped from the moving lifeboat into the ocean, hitting the water hard. She went deep underwater, and as she surfaced, something struck her head with tremendous force. She would later learn that one of the propellers had come out of the water as the ship's stern rose, and either the propeller blade or a piece of debris from the churning water had hit her skull. She sustained a serious head injury but managed to stay conscious and keep swimming. Other survivors pulled her into a different lifeboat. She was dizzy and bleeding, but alive. The Britannic sank in just 55 minutes, faster than any large ship had sunk before. But because it was in shallower water during daylight hours, and because the crew was well trained, only 30 people died. Violet was among the nearly 1,100 survivors. She'd now survived 3 of the most famous maritime disasters in history, all involving Olympic-class ocean liners. 3 of the largest ships ever built, 3 sisters, in a sense, each meeting disaster with Violet aboard. The odds of being present for one such disaster were small. The odds of surviving all 3 approached the astronomical. Yet Violet continued working at sea. She returned to work aboard the Olympic after recovering from her head injury. She worked aboard merchant ships and passenger ships for decades, eventually retiring in 1950 after nearly 40 years at sea. She lived quietly until her death in 1971 at age 83, never having married, dedicating her life to the sea that had tried to kill her 3 times and failed each time. In her autobiography, published posthumously, Violet wrote about her experiences with a calmness that seems almost surreal. She described the Titanic sinking as if it were just another difficult shift at work, just another problem to solve. She wrote about holding that baby in the lifeboat, about the cold, about the stars that night, about the terrible sound the ship made as it broke apart. She wrote about jumping from the Britannic's lifeboat, about the moment she realized she was swimming directly toward the ship's propellers, about the impact to her head and the certainty that she was about to die. She wrote about it all in clear, simple prose, as if recounting ordinary events rather than escapes from death. She kept a diary throughout her life, and in it, she reflected on her survival. She wrote that she felt she'd been kept alive for a reason, though she was never sure what that reason was. She wondered if she was meant to witness these events, to carry the memory of them forward, to be living proof that sometimes people survive the unsurvivable. She wondered if there was a purpose to her pattern of presence at disasters, or if she'd simply been cosmically unlucky in a way that happened to keep her alive. Violet Jessup's story raises questions about fate and randomness that have no clear answers. Was she protected by something, spared repeatedly because some greater plan needed her to live? Or was she simply remarkably lucky in her unluckiness, present at disasters but positioned perfectly to survive them? The question remains unanswered. What's certain is that Violet Jessup lived through 3 of the 20th century's most dramatic ship disasters, 3 events that by all rights should have killed her, and she died peacefully decades later in her own bed, undefeated by the sea she'd spent her life upon. The Dream of Aberfan. On October 21st, 1966, a coal waste tip collapsed above the Welsh village of Aberfan, sending a massive slide of debris down the mountain. It destroyed Pantglass Junior School and several houses, killing 144 people, including 116 children. The disaster happened at 9:15 in the morning. Most of the children died in their classrooms, crushed under tons of coal slurry and rock. The last day of so many young lives began normally, with breakfast and backpacks and the routine of a Friday morning, and ended in darkness and silence. In the weeks following the tragedy, psychiatrist John Barker researched accounts of premonitions related to the disaster. He placed advertisements in newspapers asking people to come forward if they'd had any form of warning before Aberfan. He found 76 people who claimed to have had premonitions, dreams, or inexplicable feelings of dread in the days and weeks before the disaster. The most compelling and heartbreaking account came from the parents of 10-year-old Errol Mai Jones, who had died in the disaster. 2 weeks before it happened, Errol Mai told her mother about a dream she'd had the night before. In the dream, she went to school, but the school wasn't there anymore. Something black had come down all over it, covering everything. Her mother, thinking it was just a child's nightmare, comforted her and thought nothing more of it. The day before the disaster, Errol Mai said to her mother something that would haunt her forever. "I'm not afraid to die, Mummy." When her mother asked why she would say such a thing, Errol Mai replied, "I'll be with Peter and June." Peter and June were 2 of her classmates. All 3 children died the next day, buried together under the rubble of their school. Errol Mai's mother only remembered these conversations after the disaster, when the horrifying specificity of what her daughter had dreamed matched exactly what had happened. The black thing that came down, the school that wasn't there, Peter and June. But Errol Mai wasn't the only one. A woman in Plymouth, over 200 miles away, had a dream 10 days before the disaster where she saw a Welsh mining village sliding down a mountain, children screaming, and a schoolhouse collapsing. She told several friends about the dream before Aberfan happened. When she saw news footage of the disaster, she recognized the village from her dream, even though she'd never been to Wales and had no connection to Aberfan. A man in northwest England woke up screaming 3 days before the disaster, having dreamed of children's faces covered in something dark and wet, children calling for help. He told his wife the dream felt different from normal dreams, that it felt like something terrible was trying to warn him. A woman who lived near Aberfan had felt an overwhelming urge to keep her own children home from school that Friday. She couldn't explain why, but the feeling was so strong that she invented an excuse about needing them to help her with chores. Her children complained but stayed home. They survived because their mother obeyed an instinct she didn't understand. Multiple people in Aberfan itself reported hearing strange sounds in the days before the disaster, rumbling from the mountain, creaking and groaning as if the earth itself was straining under some unbearable weight. Coal board officials had been warned repeatedly that the tip was unstable, that the spring water running beneath it was undermining its foundations, but no action was taken. The physical warnings were ignored, and so perhaps the premonitions were the universe's way of trying harder. Barker's research found that the premonitions clustered in time, intensifying as the disaster approached. Most occurred within 2 weeks of the event. Many dreamers reported similar imagery: blackness, children, screaming, schools, mountains, something coming down. The consistency of these elements across dozens of independent accounts from people who had no contact with each other suggests something more than random anxiety dreams. After publishing his research, Barker established the British Premonitions Bureau, a registry where people could record their premonitions of disasters before they happened. The Bureau collected thousands of reports over the years. Some premonitions were accurate, most were not, but Aberfan remains the most documented case of collective premonition before a disaster, suggesting that tragedy might not only move forward through time, but also might send ripples backward, warnings that most minds don't know how to interpret. The village of Aberfan never fully recovered. The tip was finally removed, decades too late. A memorial garden now stands where Pantglass Junior School once stood. Every year on October 21st, survivors and relatives gather there to remember. And every year, someone mentions the dreams, the warnings that came too early or too subtle to save anyone, the strange weight of knowing that some people saw it coming but had no way to stop it. The book that saved a life 3 times. During World War I, a British soldier received a metal pocket Bible as a gift. He kept it in his breast pocket. During battle, a bullet struck him directly in the chest. The Bible stopped the bullet, saving his life. He survived the war and kept the Bible years later. His son carried the same Bible during World War II. He too was shot in the chest, and the Bible, still bearing the indentation from the first bullet, stopped the second bullet, saving his life as well. The son survived the war and kept the Bible. His grandson later carried it during the Vietnam War. He was shot in the chest, and the Bible, now with 2 bullet marks, stopped the third bullet. The Bible is now in a museum with 3 distinct bullet impacts on it, each one representing a life saved across 3 generations and 3 wars. The mathematical probability of this happening once is extraordinary. 3 times across 3 generations defies any explanation rooted in chance. The Hotel Room 217. Stephen King stayed at the Stanley Hotel in Colorado in 1974. He and his wife were the only guests in the hotel as it was closing for the season that night. King had a nightmare that his young son was being chased through the hotel's hallways by a fire hose. He woke up and immediately knew he had the story for his next novel. He wrote The Shining based on that one night at the Stanley Hotel, specifically naming room 217 as the haunted room because that was his room number. The novel was published in 1977 and became one of his most famous works. Here's where it gets strange. After the book and subsequent film became famous, the Stanley Hotel embraced its connection to the story room 217, became the most requested room in the hotel. Guests who stayed there, unaware of its specific history, consistently reported the same phenomena: the feeling of being watched, items moving on their own, the sense of a presence in the bathroom. Multiple guests in separate accounts years apart described seeing a woman in period clothing in the room who would arrange their belongings and then vanish. The hotel staff eventually confirmed that a housekeeper named Elizabeth Wilson had been injured in room 217 in 1911 when a gas explosion occurred. She'd survived but had been forever changed by the experience. King had stayed in a genuinely haunted room, had a prophetic nightmare about his son being chased, and created a story that made the room's haunting permanent and famous: the nightmare, the room, the real ghost, and the fictional story all converged in a single night. The painting that killed its subjects. The Anguished Man is a painting that allegedly killed its creator and has tormented every owner since. The artist, whose name has been lost, reportedly mixed his own blood into the paint while creating it, then took his own life shortly after completing the work. The painting shows a tortured figure, a man holding his face in apparent agony. In 1985, a man named Sean Robinson inherited the painting from his grandmother, who had kept it in her attic for 25 years. She refused to display it, claiming it brought darkness into any room where it hung. Robinson hung it in his home and immediately experienced phenomena: unexplained sounds, shadows moving across walls, the figure in the painting appearing to move. He set up cameras and recorded what appeared to be objects moving on their own and shadow figures crossing the room. His family members reported feeling physically ill when near the painting, experiencing severe headaches and nausea. Several people who viewed the painting online reported similar effects, claiming they felt watched or experienced mechanical failures with their devices while the image was on screen. The painting has been examined and confirmed to contain human blood mixed into the pigment. Whether the phenomena are real or the result of suggestion, the pattern of tragedy and distress following this object is well documented. The phone call from nowhere. In 2008, a train derailed in California, killing 25 people. In the wreckage, a cell phone belonging to one of the victims kept calling the man's fiancée. She received 12 calls over the course of several hours. Each time she answered, there was silence, then what sounded like wind or static. Then the call would disconnect. The phone was later recovered from the wreckage, completely destroyed and non-functional. There was no battery power left. The call logs on her phone matched no calls in his phone's outgoing record. The phone company confirmed the calls came from his number, but couldn't explain how. Given the phone's condition, she kept the final voicemail, which contained 30 seconds of silence, followed by what sounds like someone trying to speak but being unable to form words. The voicemail has been analyzed by audio experts who confirm there are patterns in the static that resemble speech, but no actual words can be discerned. She claims she knows it was him trying to say goodbye, reaching across the boundary between life and death through the one connection they still shared, the Winchester Mystery House. Sarah Winchester, heiress to the Winchester rifle fortune, believed she was haunted by the spirits of everyone killed by Winchester rifles. After her husband William died in 1881, followed by the death of their infant daughter years earlier, Sarah was left alone with an enormous fortune and crushing grief. She consulted a medium in Boston who told her that the family was cursed. The spirits of all those killed by Winchester rifles were seeking revenge. The medium said Sarah must move west and build a house for the spirits. As long as construction never stopped, as long as she kept building, the spirits couldn't harm her. The day construction stopped would be the day she died. Sarah bought an unfinished farmhouse in San Jose, California in 1884 and immediately began expanding it. She didn't stop for 38 years. Construction continued 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers operated in shifts. The sound of hammers and saws never ceased. Sarah would hold seances every night in a special room painted blue, a color she believed attracted good spirits and repelled evil ones. In these seances, she claimed to receive building instructions directly from the spirits themselves. The house grew into a sprawling mansion of 160 rooms spread across 6 acres, but the construction followed no logical plan because the spirits' instructions made no logical sense. Staircases were built that led directly into ceilings. Doors opened onto brick walls. Windows looked into other rooms rather than outside hallways curved back on themselves in impossible loops. One staircase has 44 steps but rises only 9 feet, each step barely 2 inches high. Another staircase descends 7 steps, turns a corner, descends 7 more steps, and ends at a door that opens to a 1-foot drop to the floor. There are doors in the floor that open to nowhere, just a fall to the room below. There are cabinets that are 1 inch deep, too shallow to hold anything. There are skylights built into floors. There are chimneys that rise nearly to the ceiling and then stop, never reaching the roof. Rooms were built and then deliberately sealed up while still complete and furnished, locked away forever during Sarah's lifetime. Sarah had a morbid fascination with the number 13. The house has 13 bathrooms. Many windows have 13 panes. The walls are covered with patterns of 13 panels. Many staircases have 13 steps. She would sign her will 13 times. The house was built on property that measured 13 acres before she sold off some of it. Whether the spirits demanded 13 or whether Sarah's grief had found a number to obsess over, the pattern recurs throughout the structure. After Sarah's death in 1922, it took 6 weeks for movers and surveyors to map the interior of the house. They would enter a room, map its doors and passages, and then find that one of those passages led to a room they'd already mapped, but from a direction that seemed impossible. The house has only one working fireplace, despite having 47 fireplaces built. Most were never connected to chimneys. They're decorative, or perhaps they were meant to house spirits rather than fires. Here's what makes the Winchester Mystery House truly unsettling. During those 38 years of continuous construction, on a project employing dozens of workers simultaneously working with dangerous tools and heavy materials in a confusing and constantly changing structure, there were 0 construction accidents. Not a single worker died. Not a single serious injury was recorded. In an era when construction deaths were common, when safety regulations barely existed, when men worked with primitive equipment and few protections, Sarah Winchester's maze of madness was somehow perfectly safe. It was as if the spirits were protecting the house that kept them appeased. Or perhaps Sarah's nightly seances weren't about receiving building instructions, but about negotiating the safety of her workers in exchange for continuing to build whatever the mechanism. The statistical improbability of 38 years of accident-free construction on such a chaotic project approaches the impossible. The house has been open to tours since shortly after Sarah's death. Tour guides and visitors report phenomena consistently. The smell of chicken soup cooking in kitchens that haven't had working stoves in a century. The sound of organ music from Sarah's ballroom when no one is there and the organ doesn't work. Footsteps in empty hallways. Doors that open and close by themselves. Cold spots in rooms that have no windows or apparent drafts. The feeling of being watched, particularly in the seance room where Sarah communed with her spirits nightly. One room, called the Hall of Fires, has multiple fireplaces along one wall. Visitors consistently report feeling uncomfortable in this room, experiencing dizziness, nausea, and overwhelming sadness. Some have fainted. The room has been studied for carbon monoxide, electrical anomalies, and infrasound, but nothing definitive has been found to explain the consistent physiological responses people have when they enter it. Sarah Winchester died in her sleep at age 82. Construction on the house stopped immediately, just as the medium had predicted it would. The half-finished rooms remain half-finished today, frozen at the moment of her death. A wall was being built that morning. The bricks stopped mid-wall, the mortar still visible. The work abandoned the instant Sarah stopped breathing, as if the workers knew, without being told, that their protection had ended and the house no longer wanted them there. The doppelganger warning. In July 1981, a woman named Carol was driving through Pennsylvania when she saw herself walking along the side of the road. She describes the experience as completely clear and undeniable. The woman walking looked exactly like her, wore the same clothes she was wearing, and turned to look directly at her car as she passed. Carol pulled over, shaken, and got out of the car. The figure was gone. She drove back to the spot and found nothing. 2 weeks later, Carol was diagnosed with a brain tumor. She had surgery and recovered, but she remains convinced that seeing her doppelganger was a warning, her body's way of telling her something was seriously wrong. Folklore across multiple cultures holds that seeing your own doppelganger is a death omen. Queen Elizabeth I reportedly saw hers lying in bed, pale and still, shortly before her death. Abraham Lincoln saw his double in a mirror days before his assassination. In most accounts, the doppelganger appears shortly before a major life crisis or death. While this could be dismissed as coincidence or symptoms of medical conditions, the consistency of these accounts across cultures and throughout history suggests a pattern that's difficult to ignore. The family of 5 siblings, born on February 20th. The Henriksen family of Norway had 5 children, all born on February 20th, but in different years. The first child was born February 20th, 1960. The second was born February 20th, 1962. The third was born February 20th, 1964. The fourth was born February 20th, 1966. And the fifth was born February 20th, 1968. None of the births were induced or planned via cesarean section. All were natural births that happened to occur on the same date. The probability of this occurring by chance is approximately 1 in 17 billion. The family became famous in Norway, with people treating February 20th as a kind of lucky day. The parents, when interviewed, said they never planned it and were as surprised as everyone else each time another child was born on that date. They described it as feeling like they were caught in a loop, destined to add to their family on that one specific day. The Golden Gate Bridge Premonition. In May 1937, the Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco was completed. On opening day, 200,000 people walked across it in celebration. Among them was a man named Harold Waber, a World War I veteran who had fought at the Battle of the Somme. He was one of the first people to cross the bridge that day. 4 months later, in August 1937, Waber returned to the bridge with a friend halfway across. He told his friend, "This is where I get off." He jumped, becoming the first documented person to take their own life from the Golden Gate Bridge. Before he jumped, he handed his friend a suicide note he'd written weeks earlier. The note was dated May 27th, 1937, the bridge's opening day. He'd known, even as he celebrated the bridge's opening, that he would return to die there. The bridge has since become one of the most common locations for people ending their own lives, with over 1,500 documented cases. But Waber's premonition of his own death, written on the day he first saw the bridge, suggests he understood something about that structure the moment he encountered it, the lighthouse keeper's warning. In 1900, 3 lighthouse keepers vanished from the Flannan Isles lighthouse off the coast of Scotland. When a relief keeper arrived on December 26th, he found the lighthouse empty. The clocks had stopped. A meal was on the table, half-eaten. 1 chair was knocked over. 2 of the 3 keepers' oilskin coats were missing, but the 3rd coat remained hanging by the door. The lighthouse log contained increasingly frantic entries about storms of a severity never recorded in the area, with the final entry noting that the storms had finally ceased and all was calm. That entry was dated December 15th. The relief keeper arrived 11 days later. No storm had been reported in the area during that time. The 3 men were never found. What makes this particularly strange is a ballad written in 1899 by a Scottish poet named Wilfred Wilson Gibson. The ballad, called Flannan Isle, describes 3 lighthouse keepers vanishing mysteriously, leaving behind signs of hurried departure. Gibson wrote this a full year before the actual disappearance occurred. When the news of the real disappearance broke, Gibson's poem was republished, and people believed he'd written it about the actual event. Gibson maintained that his poem was fictional and written before the incident, but the similarities are too specific to dismiss easily. The coincidence that ended World War I. On November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., World War I officially ended with the signing of the armistice, the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. This timing wasn't coincidental in the sense of being accidental. It was deliberately chosen for its numerological significance. But here's the strange part. The last soldier killed in World War I, an American named Henry Gunther, died at 10:59 a.m., 1 minute before the ceasefire. He charged a German machine gun position that was trying to wave him off, as the German soldiers knew the war was ending in seconds. They reluctantly fired, killing Gunther at 10:59. The last man to die in a war that killed millions died 60 seconds before peace, killed by enemy soldiers who didn't want to kill him, charging a position he didn't need to take. The precision of that timing, the tragedy of it, feels less like coincidence and more like the war demanded one final sacrifice at the exact moment of its ending. The painting that predicted 9/11. In 1967, artist Mark Lombardi began creating intricate diagrams mapping financial connections between people, corporations, and governments. His work was abstract but based on meticulous research of public records. In 1996, he created a piece titled BCCI, ICIC, and FAB, 1972 to 91, mapping connections between the Bank of Credit and Commerce International, various terrorist organizations, and members of the bin Laden family. The diagram showed financial flows that wouldn't become publicly known until after September 11, 2001. After the attacks, FBI agents visited Lombardi's studio and spent hours examining his work, trying to understand how he'd mapped these connections years before they became relevant. Lombardi died in March 2000, 18 months before 9/11, under circumstances ruled a suicide, but which some considered suspicious. His work showed links that wouldn't be fully understood until after the attacks. He didn't live to see whether he uncovered something dangerous or simply had an intuitive understanding of how criminal networks operate. His diagrams remain as a kind of prophecy, drawn years before the events they seemed to predict. The three ships named after death. Three ships, built by different companies in different countries, were all named Morro Castle. The first Morro Castle was a Spanish prison ship that transported prisoners from Cuba. It sank in a hurricane in 1768, killing everyone aboard. The second Morro Castle was a cruise ship that caught fire off the coast of New Jersey in 1934, killing 137 people. The fire started in suspicious circumstances, and arson was suspected but never proven. The third Morro Castle was a cargo ship that disappeared in the Bermuda Triangle in 1941, with all hands lost. Three ships, same name, all ending in disaster with complete or near complete loss of life. The name Morro Castle comes from a fortress in Havana, a place associated with imprisonment and execution. Naming ships after such a place might seem like tempting fate, and in these three cases, fate apparently accepted the challenge. The man who couldn't drown. In the early 1900s, a man named Owen Coffin survived 4 separate shipwrecks. In each case, he was the only survivor, or one of very few survivors. He became known among sailors as either extremely lucky or cursed, depending on who you asked. Other sailors refused to serve on ships with him, believing he brought disaster. The truly strange part of Coffin's story is his ancestor. His great-great-grandfather was also named Owen Coffin, and he had been one of the crew members of the whaling ship Essex, which was sunk by a sperm whale in 1820. That Owen Coffin had drawn the short straw in the lot to see who would be consumed by the survivors. Just like the Richard Parker story mentioned earlier, he was killed and eaten by his fellow survivors, including his cousin, the ship's captain. The descendant Owen Coffin survived multiple maritime disasters that killed everyone around him, as if he were repaying a debt or breaking a curse that began with his ancestor's death at sea, the Bermuda Triangle's first victim. The most famous disappearance in the Bermuda Triangle was Flight 19, a group of 5 Navy torpedo bombers that vanished in 1945. But the first well-documented disappearance was a ship called the USS Cyclops in 1918. The Cyclops was a massive Navy cargo ship, 542 feet long, carrying 306 crew and passengers. It left Barbados on March 4, 1918, heading for Baltimore. It never arrived. No distress signal was ever sent. No wreckage was ever found. No bodies were ever recovered. The ship simply vanished with all hands in good weather on a calm sea. What makes this particularly eerie is that the Cyclops had 2 sister ships, the Proteus and the Nereus, identical in design. In 1941, both sister ships also vanished without a trace in the same region, also in good weather, also without distress signals. 3 identical ships, all disappearing in the same area of ocean, all without leaving any evidence of what happened to them. The Cyclops alone was the single largest loss of life in U.S. naval history, not related to combat. The reincarnated fighter pilot. James Leininger was 2 years old when he started having violent nightmares about being in a plane crash. He would wake up screaming, thrashing in his bed, crying out the same phrases: airplane crash on fire, little man can't get out. His parents, Bruce and Andrea Leininger, initially dismissed it as normal childhood fears. Perhaps he'd seen something on television, they thought. Perhaps it was just an overactive imagination. But the nightmares persisted and intensified. James would wake up 3 or 4 times a night, screaming about being shot down, about fire, about water. His parents started documenting what he said, writing down the specific phrases he used when he was barely conscious, still trapped between the nightmare and waking little man can't get out. The plane's on fire, can't get out. As James grew slightly older and his vocabulary expanded, his descriptions became more detailed and more troubling. He began describing specific aspects of World War II aircraft. He knew the technical names for airplane parts that most adults don't know. He could identify aircraft types from pictures, not just American planes, but Japanese planes, planes from multiple nations. He drew pictures obsessively, always the same subject: planes being shot down, planes on fire, planes crashing into water. The pictures were violent and detailed, showing an understanding of aerial combat that no 3-year-old should possess. His parents were disturbed enough to take him to a psychologist. The psychologist suggested the nightmares might stem from a past life memory, a concept the Leiningers, who were Christians and didn't believe in reincarnation, initially rejected. But the nightmares continued, and James's knowledge continued to expand in ways that seemed impossible. James told his parents his plane had been hit by the Japanese, had caught fire, and had crashed into water. He said he'd flown from a ship called the Natoma. His father, a former police officer and skeptic, decided to research this information, expecting to prove it was just a child's fantasy. He discovered that the USS Natoma Bay was a World War II escort carrier that had served in the Pacific. The ship existed. That was the first verification. Bruce Leininger then obtained the roster of pilots who'd served on the Natoma Bay. He found that only one pilot from that ship had died in the manner James described: James M. Houston Jr., whose Corsair fighter had been hit by anti-aircraft fire from the island of Iwo Jima on March 3, 1945. The plane had caught fire and crashed into the Pacific Ocean. Houston's body was never recovered. But the coincidences didn't stop there. James Leininger also mentioned having a friend named Jack Larson who'd been with him when he died. Bruce found that Jack Larson had been a real pilot who'd served on the Natoma Bay with Houston and had witnessed his death from another plane. Larson was still alive, living in Arkansas. Bruce contacted Larson, who confirmed everything James had described. He'd been flying in formation with Houston when Houston's plane was hit. He described watching the plane catch fire, seeing Houston try to control it, then watching it spiral into the ocean. Houston's plane had been hit in the front, exactly where James had said. It had burned exactly as James described. Larson was shaken by how much the little boy knew. The Leiningers then contacted James Houston's sister, who was still alive in her 80s. When they showed her James's drawings and told her his stories, she broke down crying. She said her brother used to draw pictures of planes before he enlisted, pictures that looked similar to what young James was drawing. She had photographs and letters from her brother that matched details James had mentioned. When they showed James a photograph of the crew of the Natoma Bay, he correctly identified several pilots by name, pointing to men in the group photo and calling them by their nicknames. He identified James Houston in the photo, pointing to him and saying, "That's me." As James Leininger grew older, the nightmares gradually faded. By age 8, they'd stopped completely. His obsessive knowledge of World War II aircraft diminished. He retained some interest in history and aviation, but the intense, detailed knowledge he'd possessed as a toddler seemed to evaporate, as if the memories that didn't belong to him were finally releasing their grip. The Leiningers wrote a book about their experience, documenting everything, publishing the evidence they'd gathered. Skeptics suggested that James might have encountered information about Houston somehow and unconsciously absorbed it, that his parents might have unintentionally led him toward certain answers, that the whole thing was a case of false memories reinforced by parental attention. But the skeptics struggled to explain how a 2-year-old who couldn't read could have acquired such detailed, specific knowledge about an obscure World War II pilot. They struggled to explain the nightmares that began before any research had been done, the technical knowledge that appeared before James had been exposed to any books or documentaries about the war. James Leininger is now an adult. He doesn't remember the nightmares clearly and doesn't have the detailed memories of James Houston's life that he once possessed. In interviews, he says it feels like remembering a dream, vague and distant. But the documentation exists. The recordings of his childhood statements exist. The drawings exist. The correlations between what a toddler said in Louisiana and what a fighter pilot experienced over Iwo Jima in 1945 exist, and no explanation that relies purely on conventional understanding of memory and consciousness adequately accounts for them, the tower that drives people to jump. The Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge in China, completed in 1968, stretches nearly 3 miles across the Yangtze River. It was heralded as a triumph of engineering, one of China's first major infrastructure projects completed entirely without foreign assistance. It became a source of national pride, but it also became something else, the world's most popular location for people to end their own lives. Since its construction, more than 2,000 people have jumped from the bridge. The number is likely higher, as not all attempts are recorded and some bodies are never recovered from the river below. The bridge stands about 160 feet above the water, high enough that survival is nearly impossible. The fall alone is often enough to be lethal, and if someone survives the impact, the river's current and temperature usually finish what gravity started. What makes the Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge particularly disturbing isn't just the number of deaths, but the patterns around them. People travel significant distances to reach this specific bridge. They pass other bridges, other tall structures, other opportunities, but they come to Nanjing. They come to this bridge. When interviewed by media or authorities before being talked down, many struggle to explain why they chose this location. They say they felt drawn to it, that they'd thought about it, and this bridge was where they needed to be. Some say they dreamed about the bridge before ever visiting it. Some say it called to them. Chen Si, a local man who owned an antique shop, started noticing the pattern in 2000. He would see people on the bridge, standing near the railing, alone, with a particular look on their faces. He started approaching these people, talking to them, trying to understand what they were feeling. He realized he could identify potential jumpers by their body language, their facial expressions, and something less tangible that he described as an aura of finality. In 2003, Chen Si began patrolling the bridge every weekend. He would wake up early, spend the entire day walking back and forth across the nearly 3-mile span, watching for people who displayed the signs he'd learned to recognize. He paid for this work out of his own pocket, gave up his weekends, sacrificed time with his family, all to save strangers. His method was simple. He would approach the person, strike up a casual conversation, and try to draw them away from the railing. He would invite them for tea, offer to listen, treat them not as someone about to commit a desperate act, but as a friend he just happened to meet. His gentle approach worked. Over the course of 2 decades, Chen Si personally saved over 400 lives, people who had climbed over the railing or were moments from jumping. Some of those he saved stayed in contact with him afterward. They told him that at the moment he interrupted them, they'd been in a kind of trance. They described feeling like they weren't fully in control of their bodies, like they were watching themselves from outside. When Chen touched them or spoke to them, they said it was like snapping out of a dream. Suddenly they were standing on a bridge railing with traffic behind them and water far below, and they didn't entirely understand how they'd gotten there. Chen kept detailed notes about the people he helped. He noticed patterns. Many couldn't clearly articulate what had driven them to the bridge. They had problems, yes, financial troubles, relationship failures, family conflicts, but the problems weren't always severe enough to fully explain the suicide attempt. Some described the bridge as appearing in their thoughts persistently, as if it were suggesting itself to them. One man told Chen he'd been lying in bed in Shanghai when he suddenly had the thought, "Go to Nanjing Bridge." The thought was intrusive and insistent. He'd tried to ignore it, but it kept returning. Finally, he bought a bus ticket, rode 3 hours to Nanjing, walked to the bridge, and climbed the railing. Chen talked to him for 40 minutes before convincing him to climb back down. The bridge itself has been studied by architects and psychologists trying to understand why it attracts such tragedy. Some suggest the height is optimal, high enough to ensure death, but not so high that it triggers immediate fear. The barrier railings are low enough that climbing over them doesn't require much effort or planning. The bridge is always accessible, always open, unlike some buildings or structures that have security. But these practical explanations don't fully account for the bridge's magnetic quality. Other bridges with similar characteristics don't have the same concentration of deaths. The Golden Gate Bridge in San Francisco has more fame in Western culture as a place for people to end their lives, but it has fewer actual deaths than the Nanjing Bridge, despite being much older and serving a much wealthier population. Some have suggested that the bridge's history plays a role. It was built during the Cultural Revolution, a period of immense social upheaval and suffering in China. Millions died during that era, many through violence, starvation, or persecution. Some believe that collective trauma has somehow attached itself to structures built during that time, that the bridge carries an imprint of the era's darkness. Others point to feng shui, the traditional Chinese practice of harmonizing individuals with their environment. Feng shui practitioners have analyzed the bridge and claimed its design and orientation create a flow of negative energy. The bridge cuts across the river at an angle that supposedly disrupts natural energy patterns. Whether this has any basis in reality or is simply another way of naming something people sense but can't explain, the belief persists. Chen Si has installed cameras on parts of the bridge to help him monitor sections he can't physically reach. He's trained volunteers to help him patrol. He's created a kind of informal suicide prevention network centered around this one structure. Local police know him and support his work. Taxi drivers have his number and call him when they drop passengers at the bridge who seem distressed. Despite his efforts, people still die at the Nanjing Yangtze River Bridge. Chen can't be everywhere at once. He can't catch everyone. Some people jump when no one is watching. Some are determined enough that they wait until Chen or his volunteers aren't present. Each death weighs on him. He keeps photographs of the people he's saved on his phone, hundreds of faces, hundreds of lives that continued because he was there at the right moment. In interviews, Chen Si says he doesn't believe the bridge is cursed in any supernatural sense, but he does believe it has taken on a dark reputation that perpetuates itself. People who are contemplating ending their lives hear about the Nanjing Bridge. It becomes fixed in their minds as the place to go. The bridge's notoriety creates its own reality, drawing more people to it, creating more deaths, enhancing its reputation in an endless cycle. But he also admits there's something about the bridge he can't quite explain. He's been patrolling it for over 20 years now. He knows every meter of its span, and he says there are sections of the bridge that feel different, areas where the air seems heavier, where the sound changes, where he consistently finds people at their darkest moments. These sections aren't random. They're the same spots, year after year, as if certain parts of the bridge have absorbed more suffering than others and radiate it back the prediction box. In 1930, a time capsule was buried at the New York World's Fair. Inside, among other items, was a letter written by engineer George Edward Pendray predicting what the world would be like in 1980. The capsule was set to be opened 50 years later. When it was opened in 1980, Pendray's predictions were eerily accurate. He described a world where machines had replaced much human labor, where diseases had been conquered through medical advances, where long-distance communication was instantaneous, and where tensions between nations had led to a global conflict that reshaped the world. He even predicted the existence of something like computers, describing machines that could store and process information automatically. What makes this particularly strange is that Pendray's letter included one prediction that didn't make sense in 1930 or 1980. He wrote about machines that could think and make decisions independently, and warned that humans would have to grapple with ethical questions about creating such machines. He was describing artificial intelligence decades before the concept existed. The letter is now seen as one of the most accurate long-term predictions ever recorded. The Cursed Car of Franz Ferdinand. Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria was riding in a Graf and Stift double phaeton automobile when he was assassinated in Sarajevo in 1914, an event that triggered World War I. After his death, the car took on a dark life of its own. A general who took possession of the car died in a crash 9 days later. The next owner, another military officer, had 4 accidents in 4 months, lost an arm in one of them, and eventually gave up the car. A wealthy farmer bought it, and it crushed him to death when the engine failed and pinned him against a wall. A doctor bought the car and died when it overturned. A Swiss race car driver bought it and died during a race while driving it. The car passed through several more owners, all of whom suffered severe accidents while driving it. During World War I, the car was captured and exhibited as a trophy. The building where it was stored burned down, destroying everything except the car, which survived undamaged. The car is now in a museum in Vienna, and it's reportedly kept in neutral with the parking brake permanently engaged, as if even now, over a century later, people are afraid of what might happen if it starts moving again. The prophetic song. In 1994, rapper Notorious B.I.G. released an album containing a song where he described his own death in specific detail. He rapped about being shot while sitting in a car at a red light in Los Angeles, about the shooters being in a dark-colored vehicle, and about dying before he could finish his final album. 3 years later, in March 1997, he was shot and killed while sitting in his car at a red light in Los Angeles. The shooters were in a dark Chevrolet Impala SS. He died before completing his second album. The specificity of the details he described years earlier shocked everyone who'd heard the song. Biggie wasn't the only rapper to seemingly predict his own death. Tupac Shakur, who died 6 months before Biggie, also had lyrics describing his death in detail. Both cases could be dismissed as coincidence or self-fulfilling prophecy, but the precise accuracy of their descriptions, including details they couldn't have controlled, suggests something stranger was at work. The mirrored drownings. In 1950, twins Lorraine and Lavinia Christmas were born in North Carolina. They were adopted by different families and grew up without knowing each other existed. On June 9, 1975, Lorraine drowned in a swimming pool in Ohio. On the same day, at approximately the same time, Lavinia drowned in a swimming pool in Michigan. Both were 25 years old. Both had 2 children. Both were visiting friends when the drownings occurred. Neither had a history of swimming problems. The circumstances of their deaths were so similar that when authorities were processing Lorraine's death and received information about Lavinia's death the same day, they initially thought it was a clerical error, that the same death had been reported twice. When they realized these were 2 separate people who happened to be twins, the investigation expanded. The twins had never met and had no contact with each other, yet they died in the same manner on the same day. At approximately the same time, twin studies have long documented unusual connections between separated twins. But simultaneous deaths push the phenomenon into territory that science struggles to explain. The Hotel Cecil's century of death. The Hotel Cecil in Los Angeles, built in 1924 in the heart of downtown, was meant to be grand. It opened during a golden age of Los Angeles growth, a beacon of prosperity and sophistication, but the Great Depression transformed downtown Los Angeles and the Hotel Cecil with it. The neighborhood declined, the hotel declined, and something dark took root in the building that never left. By official count, at least 16 people have died at the Hotel Cecil, but the true number is likely higher. Multiple people have taken their own lives by jumping from the building's windows, plummeting 10 or 15 stories to the street below. In the 1940s, a woman was found dead in her room, having consumed poison. In the 1960s, a woman leaped from one of the upper floors while her young daughter watched. The child had to be taken away by police, screaming for her mother. In 1964, a woman named Goldie Osgood was found strangled in her room, her body violated after death. Her neighbor, Jacques Eilinger, was convicted of her murder. He'd been heard arguing with her through the thin walls, and later, witnesses saw him leaving her room. The walls of the Hotel Cecil were thin enough to hear everything, thick enough to hide it from official notice. But the Hotel Cecil's darkest claim to fame involves serial killers. In 1985, Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, stayed at the Hotel Cecil for several weeks during his killing spree. He paid $14 a night for a room on the 14th floor. He would leave the hotel at night, commit his crimes, and return in the early morning hours covered in blood. He'd clean up in his room and sleep through the day. Other residents reported seeing him in the hallways, smelling of death, with blood on his clothes. But in the Hotel Cecil, no one asked questions. He dumped blood-stained clothes in the dumpster outside. No one noticed or no one cared. In 1991, Jack Unterweger, an Austrian journalist and convicted criminal who'd been released from prison and was writing a story about crime in Los Angeles, stayed at the Hotel Cecil. While staying there, he strangled 3 women, continuing a pattern of violence that had sent him to prison the first time he would befriend women, usually those involved in substances or difficult situations, gain their trust, and then kill them. He stayed at the Hotel Cecil for weeks while committing these crimes. After he left Los Angeles, he continued killing in Austria before being caught. He took his own life in prison the night after his conviction, using the same method he'd used to kill his victims, hanging himself with the same kind of ligature 2 serial killers, both finding the Hotel Cecil a comfortable base during their killing sprees. But why? What about that building made it attractive to predators? Some suggest it was practical, cheap rooms, a transient population, a desk staff that didn't ask questions, a location near the areas where vulnerable people congregated. But the clustering feels like more than logistics. It feels like the building itself was attracting a certain kind of darkness. Then came Elisa Lam. In January 2013, a 21-year-old Canadian student checked Ed into the Hotel Cecil. She was traveling alone, documenting her journey on social media. On January 31st, she disappeared. The hotel staff and police searched but found no trace of her. For weeks, she was simply gone. Then guests at the hotel began complaining about the water. It tasted strange. The pressure was low. Some said it was black or dark brown. The hotel sent maintenance to check the water tanks on the roof. When they opened one of the 4 large tanks, they found Elisa Lam's body floating inside, naked, decomposed. She'd been dead for weeks, and guests had been drinking, bathing in, and brushing their teeth with water that had been circulating past her corpse. The investigation revealed several disturbing facts. The water tanks were very difficult to access. You had to go to the roof, which required either a key or climbing a fire escape. Then you had to climb a ladder to reach the platform where the tanks sat. The tanks themselves had heavy lids that sealed tightly and were difficult to open. How had Elisa Lam, a young woman with no climbing experience, managed to access the roof, climb the tank, open the heavy lid, get inside, and close the lid after herself? Security footage from the hotel's elevator provided more questions than answers. The video shows Elisa entering the elevator alone, pushing multiple buttons, then standing in the corner as the doors fail to close. She peeks out into the hallway, pressing herself flat against the wall as if hiding from someone. She steps out of the elevator, looks both ways, makes strange hand gestures as if communicating with someone invisible. She presses more buttons. She gets back in the elevator. The doors still don't close. She steps out again, makes more gestures, appears to be talking to someone who isn't there. Then she walks off camera. The elevator doors finally close after she leaves. The video went viral. Millions of people watched Elisa Lam's final known moments, trying to understand what she was doing, who she might have been talking to, why she was acting so strangely. Some suggested she was playing a game called The Elevator Ritual, a Korean urban legend about accessing another dimension using elevator buttons in a specific sequence. Others noted that her behavior resembled symptoms of a psychotic break or severe panic attack. She was taking medication for bipolar disorder and depression, and toxicology showed those medications weren't in her system, suggesting she'd stopped taking them. The official conclusion was accidental drowning, possibly in the context of a mental health crisis. But the official conclusion didn't explain how she accessed the roof, how she opened the tank, how she got inside, or how the lid closed after her. It didn't explain the elevator footage, or the strange gestures, or the sense that she was interacting with something or someone that the camera couldn't capture. The Hotel Cecil closed in 2017 for renovations. It reopened in 2021 as a mixed-use building with affordable housing and some hotel rooms. The rebranding hasn't changed the building's history. The depths and darkness are part of its structure now, built into the foundation as surely as steel and concrete. Whether the Hotel Cecil attracts tragedy or creates it, whether its darkness is architectural or supernatural, the pattern is undeniable. More people have died violently in that building than can be explained by statistics or chance. Something about that place makes bad things happen, and no amount of renovation seems able to wash it clean. The phantom hitchhiker who always predicts disasters. The resurrection. Mary Legend is one of the most famous ghost stories in Chicago, but it's part of a larger pattern of phantom hitchhiker stories that occur worldwide with remarkable consistency. The pattern is always similar. A young woman in white is picked up at night, gives an address or directions, and then vanishes from the moving car. What makes these stories particularly interesting is that in multiple documented cases, the phantom hitchhiker warns the driver about an upcoming disaster before disappearing. In several cases, the disasters she warned about actually occurred. In 1979, a truck driver in rural Georgia picked up a young woman who told him a bridge ahead had collapsed and he should take another route. He did, and later learned that the bridge had indeed collapsed that night, though no warning signs had been posted. The woman had vanished from his truck without opening the door. In 1992, a similar account occurred in Japan, where a woman warned of an earthquake before disappearing. The earthquake occurred 3 days later. Whether these stories represent genuine paranormal phenomena or are examples of collective folklore, their consistency across cultures and continents suggests some deeper pattern in human experience, the three identical strangers, and their dark secret. In 1980, 19-year-old Robert Shafran arrived at college and found that everyone seemed to know him. People greeted him as Eddie. Confused, Robert eventually learned that a student named Eddie Galland, who looked exactly like him, had attended the school the previous year. When they met, they discovered they were identical twins who'd been separated at birth. The story made the news, and soon a third man, David Kellman, saw the coverage and realized he was also their identical twin. The triplets were reunited and became celebrities, appearing on talk shows and even opening a restaurant together. But the heartwarming story had a dark underbelly. The brothers had been deliberately separated as part of a secret psychological study examining nature versus nurture. The adoption agency had knowingly split them up and placed them in families of different socioeconomic backgrounds to study how they developed. The study was never published, and the agency refused to release its findings. All three brothers struggled with mental health issues. In 1995, Eddie took his own life. The surviving brothers later learned that the study had deliberately placed them in families with histories of mental health issues to examine genetic predisposition. They'd been used as test subjects without their knowledge or consent. The coincidence of their reunion exposed one of the most unethical psychological studies in modern history, the premonition that saved a plane full of people. On May 25, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191 crashed shortly after takeoff from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport. The DC-10 had an engine separate from the wing during takeoff, causing catastrophic damage to the aircraft's hydraulics and flight controls. The plane climbed to about 300 feet, rolled left, and crashed into an abandoned airfield, exploding on impact. All 271 people on board died, along with 2 people on the ground. It remains the deadliest aviation accident in United States history, but several people who had booked tickets on that flight didn't board. Their reasons for missing the flight weren't typical. These weren't cases of missed alarms or traffic delays. These were cases of premonition, of knowing without knowing, of fear without clear source. A woman named Lee Ann was scheduled to be on Flight 191. The night before, she had a nightmare that felt different from other nightmares. In the dream, she was sitting in an airplane. The plane began to shake violently. People started screaming. She looked out the window and saw the ground rushing up at an impossible speed. She saw fire and then nothing. She woke up in a state of panic so intense that her husband had to spend an hour calming her down. When morning came and it was time to go to the airport, she told her husband she couldn't board that flight. He thought she was being irrational, that she was letting a nightmare control her. They argued. Eventually, she broke down crying and said that if he made her get on that plane, he would never see her again. He believed her. They called the airline and changed her flight to the following day. She watched the news that evening and saw footage of Flight 191's wreckage. She recognized the plane from her dream. David Booth, an office manager from Cincinnati, experienced something even more disturbing. Starting 10 days before the crash, he had the same nightmare every single night. In the dream, he saw an American Airlines plane taking off. The plane tilted left, engines screaming, and then crashed in an empty field, exploding in a massive fireball. The dream was consistent, identical each night, like watching the same piece of film over and over. The dreams disturbed Booth so much that he called the FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration, to report them. He spoke to an agent and described his recurring nightmare in detail. He said he thought American Airlines was going to have a terrible accident, that he kept seeing it. The FAA agent took notes, but told Booth there wasn't much they could do with dream information. How could they ground all American Airlines flights because someone was having bad dreams? Booth understood, but felt compelled to try anyway. After the crash, investigators reviewed that phone call. Booth's description of what he'd dreamed matched the actual crash in extraordinary detail. The leftward roll, the field, the fireball. He'd been watching Flight 191 crash in his dreams every night for 10 days before it actually happened. A family of 4 had been booked on Flight 191. They were running late for their flight, unusual for them as they were typically punctual. The father later said he'd felt an unexplainable reluctance all morning, a heaviness that made every action feel difficult. He'd taken longer in the shower than usual. He'd had trouble finding his keys. He'd stopped to get coffee, even though it made them later. His wife had snapped at him for his uncharacteristic slowness. They arrived at the airport just as the plane was pushing back from the gate. They'd missed their flight by minutes. The father broke down crying in the terminal. His wife thought he was upset about missing the flight and the disruption to their plans. Only later, After the crash, did he tell her he'd been crying with relief. He said he'd known, somehow, that being late had saved their lives. A businessman named Michael had a ticket for Flight 191. The morning of the flight, he woke up with an overwhelming sense of dread. He described it as a weight on his chest, a certainty that something terrible would happen if he went to the airport. He called his assistant and told her to reschedule his meeting. She protested. The meeting was important, and he'd lose the account if he didn't attend. He told her he didn't care. He wasn't getting on a plane that day. Something was wrong, and he needed to listen to it. He lived in Chicago and ended up driving to his meeting the next day, a 6-hour drive he normally would never have made. He arrived to find his business associates shocked to see him alive. They'd assumed he'd been on Flight 191. A college student had been given a ticket to visit her grandmother in Los Angeles. Flight 191 was her first flight ever. She'd been excited but nervous. The night before, she had a dream where she was in a tube filled with smoke and screaming. When she woke up, she felt sick. She told her roommate she couldn't go, that she was too afraid to fly. Her roommate tried to convince her it was just nerves, that everyone gets scared before their first flight, but the nausea and dread were too intense. She stayed home. When she heard about the crash, she collapsed. She would never fly for the rest of her life. Statistical analysis of airline no-shows shows that Flight 191 had an unusually high number of people who didn't board despite having valid tickets. The rate was significantly higher than the baseline no-show rate for that route and time. Something was warning people away, whether it was genuine precognition, some kind of collective unconscious sensitivity to impending disaster, or a series of remarkable coincidences. Multiple people received information that a terrible thing was going to happen, and some of them listened. The crash investigation revealed that the engine separation was caused by improper maintenance procedures that had damaged the pylon attaching the engine to the wing. The damage was invisible from the outside. The plane had flown multiple flights with this underlying damage before it finally failed on Flight 191. If the same maintenance procedure had been done differently, if mechanics had used a different method to remove and replace the engine, if the inspection had caught the microscopic crack, the crash wouldn't have happened. But it did happen, and before it happened, people dreamed about it, felt it, knew it was coming, even though, logically, they couldn't have known. The locked room mystery that was real. Isidore Fink was a laundry operator in New York City. On March 9, 1929, neighbors heard shots fired and screams from his locked apartment. Police broke down the door and found Fink dead from gunshot wounds. Every window was locked from the inside. The door had been locked from the inside. There was no weapon in the room. The police searched everywhere and found no way anyone could have entered or exited the room after it was locked. Fink had been shot twice, once in the chest and once in the hand, suggesting he'd tried to defend himself. But there was no one else in the room, no way for a shooter to have escaped, and no gun. The case was investigated for months and eventually declared officially unsolved. The police commissioner called it an impossible crime. The case remains in official records as the only completely unexplained locked room murder in New York City police history. Every detective who studied the case agreed that the murder was impossible, yet it had clearly occurred. The cursed painting of crying boys. In the 1980s, a series of house fires across Britain were linked by one strange commonality. In each burned house, a print of a painting called "The Crying Boy" survived undamaged. The painting, created by Italian artist Giovanni Bragolin, depicted a young boy with tears running down his face. After several fires, a British tabloid ran a story about the curse of the crying boy painting, and suddenly hundreds of people came forward claiming their homes had burned down, but the painting had survived. Some reported that their fires had started near the painting, but the painting itself showed no damage. A fire brigade officer noted that he'd seen the painting intact in several fire-damaged homes and found it statistically unusual. The story grew into mass hysteria, with people destroying their copies of the painting. The Sun newspaper even organized a mass burning of the prints. Skeptics pointed out that the prints were treated with a varnish that was fire-resistant and that the painting was enormously popular, so it would statistically appear in many homes. But the sheer number of reports and the consistent detail that the painting survived while everything around it burned created a legend that persists today. The twins born 87 days apart. In 1995, a woman named Amy Jones gave birth to twin girls. The first twin, Katie, was born extremely premature. Doctors did everything they could to delay the birth of the second twin to give her a better chance of survival. They succeeded beyond anyone's expectations. The second twin, Amy, wasn't born until 87 days later, nearly 3 months after her sister. Both girls survived and were healthy. They are officially recognized as twins, despite being born almost a quarter of a year apart. What makes this more than just a medical curiosity is that throughout her life, Katie has reported feeling when her sister Amy is in distress. Despite them living in different cities as adults, Amy has reported the same connection in reverse. They describe it as a sensation of something being wrong, a pulling feeling that only occurs when the other is experiencing a crisis. Medical science can explain their unusual birth, but the persistent connection they describe pushes into territory where biology offers no clear answers. The Prophecy Rock. In Hopi tradition, there's a rock carving called Prophecy Rock that depicts the future of humanity. The carving shows two paths, one path where humans live in balance with nature, and another where humans destroy themselves through greed and violence. The carving includes symbols that Hopi elders interpret as predicting specific events. They claim the carving predicted the arrival of Europeans, the use of electricity, the atomic bomb, and the landing on the moon. The carving was created centuries before any of these events occurred. Skeptics argue that the interpretations are retroactive, that people are seeing what they want to see in ambiguous symbols. But Hopi elders, who have maintained oral traditions for generations, insist that the interpretations haven't changed, that their ancestors understood what these symbols meant and passed that knowledge down. Whether the rock actually predicts the future or whether it's a case of interpretation finding meaning in ambiguity, the Hopi's confidence in its prophecies has remained consistent for centuries. The coincidence that started World War I. Archduke Franz Ferdinand's assassination, which triggered World War I, occurred because of a series of improbable coincidences. The assassin, Gavrilo Princip, had been part of a group that tried to kill Ferdinand earlier that day. They'd failed and scattered. Princip was sitting in a cafe, depressed, thinking the assassination had failed completely. Ferdinand's driver took a wrong turn and then stalled the car while trying to reverse. The car stopped directly in front of the cafe where Princip was sitting. Princip saw Ferdinand, walked over and shot him and his wife at point-blank range. If the driver hadn't taken a wrong turn, if the car hadn't stalled, if Princip had chosen a different cafe or had left a minute earlier, World War I might never have happened. One wrong turn, one stalled car, and millions of deaths followed. The universe turned on a coincidence so absurd that if it appeared in a novel, critics would call it lazy writing, the mysterious disappearance of Owen Parfitt. In June 1768, a man named Owen Parfitt was sitting in a chair outside his home in England. His sister went inside to prepare dinner. She was gone for less than 15 minutes. When she returned, her brother was gone. The chair was still there, positioned exactly as it had been. There were no footprints leading away from the chair. There were no signs of struggle. Owen Parfitt had simply vanished. Investigators found no evidence of where he'd gone. He was elderly and paralyzed, unable to walk. There was no way he could have left on his own. No one saw him being carried away. No one heard anything unusual. He was simply there one moment and gone the next, as if he'd been erased from existence. The case was investigated extensively, but no explanation was ever found. To this day, the disappearance of Owen Parfitt remains one of Britain's most inexplicable missing person cases. The miracle of Fatima's dancing sun. On October 13, 1917, over 70,000 people gathered in Fatima, Portugal, because 3 children had claimed the Virgin Mary would perform a miracle that day. At noon, witnesses reported that the sun began to dance in the sky, spinning, changing colors, and appearing to plunge toward Earth before returning to its normal position. The phenomenon was witnessed by believers and skeptics alike, including journalists and scientists who'd come to debunk the claims. Newspapers published accounts confirming that something unusual had occurred. Photographs from the day show people staring at the sky with expressions of awe and terror. Skeptics have proposed explanations ranging from mass hysteria to unusual atmospheric conditions, but the consistency of the accounts from 70,000 separate witnesses, many of whom were skeptical, suggests that something genuinely unusual occurred that day. Whether it was a miracle, a psychological phenomenon, or an atmospheric event, the fact remains that tens of thousands of people saw something in the sky that defied their expectations and transformed their understanding of what was possible, the recurring dream that predicted a lottery win. In 1992, a woman named Patricia DeMauro had a recurring dream about the numbers 5, 14, 23, 32, and 41. The dream repeated for several weeks with such consistency that she finally decided to play those numbers in the lottery. She won $3.9 million. When interviewed afterward, she described the dreams as unusually vivid and specific, different from normal dreams. She said she felt compelled to play those numbers, that something was insisting she pay attention. While lottery winners often claim to have had premonitions, DeMauro's case is notable for the consistency of the dreams and the fact that she documented them with friends before actually playing the numbers, providing evidence that the premonition occurred before the event rather than being a retroactive claim. The ship that sailed itself. In 1969, a yacht called the Teignmouth Electron was found drifting in the Atlantic Ocean. The boat was intact and seaworthy. There was food, water, and supplies aboard. The logbooks were up to date, but there was no crew. The boat's owner, Donald Crowhurst, had been participating in a solo around-the-world yacht race. His log entries became increasingly strange toward the end, filled with mathematical equations and philosophical musings about time and existence. The final entry suggested he'd experienced some kind of revelation about the nature of reality and had decided to deliberately step off the boat into the ocean. But here's what's strange. Crowhurst's log entries suggested he'd discovered that time wasn't linear, that past and future were occurring simultaneously, and that he could see his own death before it happened. His final words were, "It is finished. It is finished. It is the mercy." The boat sailed on without him, as if completing the journey he'd started, and was found months later still seaworthy, still containing all his possessions, a ghost ship that had completed its voyage with no one at the helm. That's 50 coincidences that seem impossible yet happened, 50 moments where the universe revealed patterns that shouldn't exist, connections that defy explanation, timing so perfect it feels orchestrated. Whether you believe in fate, chaos, or something in between, these stories remind us that the world contains mysteries we may never fully understand. Some of these stories can be partially explained by psychology, the mind's tendency to find patterns, the way memory can be unreliable, the power of suggestion and expectation. Some can be partially explained by statistics. Given enough people and enough time, even incredibly unlikely events will occasionally occur. The birthday problem demonstrates that our intuitions about probability are often deeply flawed. But even accounting for these explanations, a residue of strangeness remains. The clustering of events around certain people, like Violet Jessup or Frayne Selak. The specific accuracy of premonitions like those before Aberfan or Flight 191, the parallel lives of the Jim twins. The impossible locked room murder of Isidore Fink. These patterns persist even after we've applied every rational framework we possess. Perhaps coincidences aren't just random intersections of unrelated events. Perhaps they're glimpses of deeper connections we don't yet understand, threads in a fabric we can't fully see. Perhaps time doesn't move in only one direction, and some events cast shadows, both forward and backward. Perhaps consciousness extends beyond individual minds in ways that science hasn't yet measured. Or perhaps coincidences really are just coincidences, random confluences of cause and effect, and the meaning we find in them says more about human nature than about the nature of reality. Perhaps we're storytelling creatures living in a random universe, forever trying to find narrative where there is only noise. The truth likely lies somewhere between these extremes. Some coincidences are meaningless. Some might represent patterns we don't yet understand. Learning to distinguish between them might be impossible, or might require a shift in how we think about causation, consciousness, and time itself. What remains certain is this: these events happened. People fell from the same window onto the same man a year apart. Edgar Allan Poe wrote about a cabin boy named Richard Parker who was consumed at sea, and decades later, a real cabin boy with that exact name was consumed in nearly identical circumstances. Two brothers died on the same moped, hit by the same taxi with the same driver and passenger, exactly 1 year apart. These aren't fictions or urban legends. They're documented events with witnesses and records. They happened, and they remain inexplicable even after we've done our best to explain them. They sit at the boundary of what we understand, asking questions we can't quite answer, suggesting possibilities we can't quite accept, and reminding us that the universe is stranger than we usually allow ourselves to believe tonight. As you drift towards sleep, consider this. Maybe the most unbelievable thing isn't that these coincidences occurred. Maybe the most unbelievable thing is that we live in a world where they're possible at all. Sleep well, and remember that reality is always stranger than we think, always deeper than we know, always ready to surprise us with one more impossible thing that somehow, undeniably, happened.